tonight. First off, thanks for all those wonderful introductions. This is indeed the most diverse version of the Brady Bunch I think I've ever seen in terms of how this screen looks. But I wanted to get started tonight with talking, of course, about the history of Indigenous folks in what will become known as South Carolina. If you've looked at what's on Class 1 online for the Modjeska School, we're going to be covering a lot of topics tonight. But
uh-oh, I just muted Robert. Hold on. Robert, you can unmute yourself?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I tried to mute everybody, but it muted you too.
Oh, no problem. As I was saying a moment ago, the big thing with this class, and this isn't just for tonight, but throughout our semester, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to ask them. I know this is a different format of classroom instruction than most of us are used to. I know certainly at Claflin we're getting used to this as well, but please feel free to ask. As you can see on your screen, you have the options of clicking on the raise hand button. You can type something in the chat section. Just do whatever you feel most comfortable doing. Now, I'm not going to be thorough in terms of talking about the indigenous history of South Carolina and then talking about the history of enslaved Africans and European interaction with what will become known as South Carolina. A lot of information, of course, is online. But what I'm going to offer tonight is an overview of what this class is trying to cover. Again, remember that the point of the Modjeska School is not just for you guys to learn the history of South Carolina, but it's also to understand how that history matters in the here and now. All right, so as you can see, Dr. Shaw has pointed out in the chat that you can also raise hands under the participants button that you have on the screen as well, so don't forget that. But we're gonna go ahead and get started. So I'm gonna first share my screen because I do have a couple of PowerPoints to share with you guys this evening. And what I'll do is I'll really talk about Indigenous Americans and then get up to the Stono Rebellion. Then I'll turn the floor over to Chief Hatcher to talk about his experiences because a lot of this history is not simply in the past, it still affects the present day. All right, so if you don't mind, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Now, Brett, I think you have to give me the option to share the screen.
Well, I thought I had done that, Robert.
Yeah, it's saying host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay. Well, keep talking while I figure it out.
Okay, sure. Now, the thing about Indigenous history in South Carolina and really Indigenous history in the Americas is that you have to understand that the Indigenous populations of the Americas, I'm talking about North and South America along with the Caribbean, these were incredibly diverse groups of people. These groups of people had many different languages, religious customs, and so forth. And so the Americas were an incredibly diverse place long before the Europeans showed up, or long before Africans were brought here. And the thing is that South Carolina is no different. South Carolina was a place that included several major indigenous tribes. And hopefully I'll be able to show you that PowerPoint just a moment of some of the tribes. You should be
able to share now, Robert.
Okay. Okay, fantastic. All right, so. Okay, so as you guys can see now, this is the PowerPoint I was talking about, right, with Indigenous Americans in South Carolina. And this is just a map that shows just some of what we call the cultural areas of North America before European first contact in the 1490s and going forward. But if you look in the South in particular, you look at this area of North America, that's really what we're going to focus on this evening. The area that will include what will become known as South Carolina. Now, South Carolina itself, according to archaeological digs, historical research, anthropological research, etc., was home to many different tribes and indigenous groups. And this map is just a snapshot of some of the groups that existed in South Carolina in this pre-European history. Now, I want to remind you guys, I'm doing a lot of disservice here because this is thousands of years of history I'm having to really sum up in just a few minutes. But as you can see from this map, all through the upstate to the Midlands and the Low Country, you had different tribes, different groups that lived throughout the state. Many of these groups would, of course, interact with Europeans once Europeans arrived on the shores of South Carolina in the 16th century. Now, these are just a few tribes in South Carolina. Again, you can feel free to take notes, but you don't really have to take very detailed notes. Again, a lot of this you can probably find online as well. But I did want to single out just a few tribes. Again, not all of them that existed in South Carolina throughout the history of this region, but certainly a few that we'll talk about as the evening progresses. So you had your Catawba tribe, the Yamasee tribe, the Cherokee, which being a native Georgian, I definitely know a lot about the Cherokee growing up in Georgia, the Tuscarora, and of course the Congaree tribe, after whom the Congaree Swamp is named. Now, all of these tribes you see on the screen were tribes that would have heavy interaction with Europeans and Africans once those groups arrived to present-day South Carolina. And you really can't think of the history of the state without thinking about the interaction between these three groups, the indigenous peoples, the Europeans, and especially the Africans too. Now, I'm going to very quickly go through some of the indigenous groups. The Catawba, they're also known as the Issa, the people of the river. They are, of course, based around the Catawba River in North and South Carolina. Again, a lot of these indigenous groups, they had a lot of contacts with each other. There is a rich history of interaction amongst the different indigenous groups, not just in South Carolina, but throughout North America. One of the things that we do know now based on archaeological research and digs across the state and across the South is that groups like the Catawba tribe actually had interactions with indigenous groups all over North America, primarily through trade. And again, you want to think of North America as being this place of vibrant cultures and societies that was really, to be blunt about it, ruined by the presence of Europeans from the early 16th century onward. Now, are there any questions before I move on? Any questions at all? So I want to make sure that I don't leave anyone behind. Okay. All right. So I want to go on for a little bit longer in terms of talking about these various tribes. I'm going to give you some details of what these tribes were like and what their main cultural contributions were to North American societies. Now, the Catawba, of course, were an incredibly powerful tribe. But again, to show you how extensive their contacts in North America were, some of their biggest conflicts were actually with tribes much further to their north, notably the Seneca tribe that was part of the Iroquois Confederacy in upstate New York. Now, the Catawba certainly are a tribe that once the Europeans arrive, they're going to have to deal with extensively in the 17th and 18th century. There's also the Yamasee tribe, which you can see here in the map was also another tribe that was pretty prominent throughout present-day South Carolina. Now, the Yamasee had groups in present-day South Carolina, in Georgia, to a lesser extent in North Carolina. The Yamasee, you should really think of more as being several tribes that were united by language and cultural customs. Again, they were also incredibly diverse internally and will become important to tonight's narrative too. And again, this kind of shows you just some of what the Yamasee did and how they lived throughout the Southeast. Now, for those of you who live in Hopkins, Eastover, who live definitely in the Midlands, but closer to Eastover and places like that, closer to Congaree River. The Yamasee, that's actually the part of the state they lived in, and they used as a buffer zone against other tribes in South Carolina. We think about the Congaree River today as having, of course, a national park, as being this place of majestic beauty. But for the Yamasee, the Congaree River area was actually useful as a buffer zone. If any of you have gone hiking in Congaree National Park or taken trips there, you probably understand that if you don't have a compass or a tour guide or GPS, it's very easy to get lost in Congaree. So that makes it quite useful as a buffer zone. Then, of course, we've got the Cherokee tribe. And the map you see on the left-hand side of the screen actually shows the extent of the Cherokee tribe's territory approximately. As you can see, they had areas that would extend into present-day Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, and of course, the Carolinas. The Cherokee will become very important to our overall story tonight because they're one of the tribes that will certainly hold the balance of power in the Southeast once they begin interacting with the English and the Spanish. Also, as you can see here, we have the Tuscarora tribe, which was a tribe that actually migrated from modern-day New York to the Carolinas region before the Europeans made first contact in the 16th century with natives in the area. Again, that shows you the extent to which North America is this vibrant place of movement for various indigenous tribes, and also an incredibly vibrant place in terms of languages, cultural customs, and so forth. And as you can see, the photographs on the right show you members of the Tuscarora tribe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries too. And this map shows you the extent to which Tuscarora exists in North Carolina. Now, one of the things that I want you guys to keep in mind this evening is that the history of South Carolina and the history of North Carolina are very much tied together in the colonial period and even before that. We're dealing with an era where borders are not nearly as set in stone as they are today in terms of state borders, national borders, etc. And certainly for the various indigenous tribes, the ideas of borders and where territory starts and stops is not quite the same as it is today. It's a lot more fluid, in other words. And finally, we have the Congaree tribe. And this is, of course, a European interpretation artwork that portrays the Congaree certainly grilling some fish. As you can see, they are practicing good social distancing as well in the process of cooking the fish. I hope you noticed that too. But the Congaree were one of the tribes that Europeans would encounter early on in their interactions with indigenous tribes in the Carolinas. Now, these tribes and many more are going to be important to tonight's story, talking about how the indigenous folks are already here, of course, before the Europeans make their first appearances in what will become known as South Carolina. And again, this shows the extent to the territory that Congaree occupied. Again, those of you living in the Midlands, even in the upstate, you really want to keep in mind that where we're living right now, most of us are living in territory that was once lived in by the Congaree tribe or by the Catawba tribe or the other tribes we're talking about this evening. Okay, so that's my first PowerPoint about the indigenous populations. I know I talked a good bit about a lot of things that were going on, but are there any questions at all before we move forward?
Robert, there was one question,
Sure.
and I think it was it Burnett was making sort of comment about one of the pictures, I think of a Yamasee woman that had what might have been a mixture of indigenous and African features. Can you discuss the degree
Sure.
to which there would have been some degree of interrelationships or intermarriage between Certainly not in this period, but we could talk about later on into the colonial period.
I noted that also.
Yeah, intermarriage between the two peoples, between particularly, enslaved African or some small free African population and indigenous peoples.
Mm-hmm. No, certainly, and I think I'm assuming that the picture you're referring to in particular is probably this one of the Yamasee tribe.
Yeah, I think that's what Burnett was saying.
Yeah, there's definitely considerable evidence of interactions between not just the indigenous peoples and the Africans, but also indigenous peoples and Europeans, right. And of course Europeans and the Africans too. That's gonna proceed as we get deeper to the 17th and 18th centuries. That is certainly present, and throughout our story, when we're thinking about the South, as I said at the top of the hour, you're thinking about the South and its early history. When we're talking about first the indigenous peoples and then Africans and Europeans, there is a lot of interaction amongst the three groups. And that interaction takes a variety of forms, including, to be blunt about it, including sex, including intermarriage, including cultural traditions mingling together. We'll talk about that more in a moment, but certainly that is going on in the Carolinas too. I saw Dr. Hale had his hand raised.
Yeah, sorry, just a real quick question. So I think I read it was in, in Peter North's work on South Carolina history before the Stono Rebellion, Black Majority. I think he referenced literature that cited when Europeans, French, English, sort of looked at South Carolina's contested territory, that they referred to indigenous communities and tribes just generally as Catawba, which I thought they translated to be survivor. So by the time the Europeans arrived, that the European perception was just indigenous communities was all one. Is that accurate in describing how white European settlers would have viewed indigenous communities, or were they able to make a distinction between the tribes? Or by that point, was there just one sort of larger indigenous community left after being decimated by disease?
Okay, that's another great question. And certainly early on when the Europeans first come to the shores of North and South Carolina, they do see this one group as being all the same. But what's going to happen over time, especially when we get to the 18th century in particular, is that the European settlers, especially the English and the Spanish, they're going to understand that the different tribes are not only different culturally, not only different linguistically, but that they also have, each tribe has its own self-interest politically too. And so what you're going to see is that they're going to understand how the different tribes have different facets to them that are worth understanding. I'll give you an example. When the English start really settling South Carolina in particular, and we'll get to this more in depth in a moment, one of the things that English traders, Spanish traders, French traders, folks who are part of this trade network throughout North America, what they have to start doing is they have to start understanding how each tribe has its own separate cultural practices in terms of trade. And so, for instance, French traders working in the modern day Midwest were incredibly adept at understanding how different tribes worked and operated. And that was very useful for them to have successful trade relations. On the other hand, in the South, the English initially had a difficult time doing that because, quite frankly, many of the English traders and settlers didn't initially try to understand those cultural differences. And so it really hindered their attempts to make bigger inroads culturally, politically, and economically into the Southeast. And this is going to really bite them in the butt as time goes on. So certainly the need to recognize how each tribe had its own different cultural practices, how each tribe was just different. Initially, the Europeans aren't too worried about that, but over time, they come to realize that's going to be really important for them in terms of not only surviving, but actually setting up colonies in this part of the world. Okay, any other questions? Let me see, I see there's another Okay. All right. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So I just spent a few minutes talking about Indigenous history, a really down and dirty version of it. Trust me, if you want a longer version, I offer a History of South Carolina course at Claflin. You're always welcome to come by and join us there as well. But now what I want to do is make a quick segue to talking about the history of Europeans and Africans, early on at least, in South Carolina. Now, when we kind of stop the clock in terms of Europe, of the indigenous histories, I want you to think about, as talking about the Catawba tribe, the Yamasee tribe, etc., to their south in the Caribbean. You have Christopher Columbus, of course, making landfall in 1492, what will become known as Hispaniola, and how the Europeans are going to slowly begin the process of exploring the Caribbean and the Americas. Now, South Carolina's history of European exploration, traditionally, we used to start that clock in the 1660s with the first English settlement. But in recent years, we've come to realize that's not really the full story. And in fact, the early history of European exploration in the Carolinas has a distinctly Spanish flair to it. Okay. Now, South Carolina, its history, of course, is tied to two things. It's tied very much to the history of slavery in the Americas, the history of the enslavement of both Africans and indigenous peoples too. But secondly, South Carolina's history, at least in this time period, is also heavily tied to the conflicts amongst the European powers between the English, the French, and the Spanish, who from the 17th century onward are beginning their fight for control and mastery of North America. Now, this map is just a really quick snapshot of some of the European exploration of the Americas, starting off with, of course, Columbus. You see with the red lines at the bottom here. But I want you to pay particular attention to Ponce de Leon and Hernando de Soto, who will make trips throughout what will become known as South Carolina in the early 16th century. Now, of course, the Spanish and the Portuguese were the first European powers to really invest in exploration of the Americas in the 1490s and moving forward. They had almost a century head start on the English and the French. And so that'll play a major role in how the Americas develops in terms of European conquest and interaction in the Americas. Now, the first settlement, the first European settlement in South Carolina, or what will become known as South Carolina, was founded not by the English, but actually by the Spanish. And part of this is because of the early exploration of the region, again, by Ponce de Leon in 1521 and Hernando de Soto in 1540. This rudimentary map you see on the screen kind of shows some of the places they explore in the early 16th century. But by 1526, the Spanish actually create the first European settlement in present-day South Carolina. And that settlement is known as San Miguel de Guadalupe. That was founded in 1526. And we think, now we're not 100% sure about this, but we're pretty sure the settlement is in what is now present-day Georgetown County, South Carolina. Now, you're probably wondering, well, okay, how do we know about this settlement, right? Because I think a lot of folks growing up, learning South Carolina history, we learn about the English settlement in the 1660s. The thing about San Miguel de Guadalupe is that most of what we know about it is through the records found in archives in Spain and the Caribbean that date back to this time period. Most of the evidence we have, and unfortunately it's not archaeological evidence, but archaeologists are working in Georgetown County right now to see if they can dig up extra evidence of this colony. But what we do know is that in 1526, the Spanish set up San Miguel essentially as an attempt to establish a foothold in North America. Now, the San Miguel colony was pretty small, only a few hundred settlers. Most of those settlers, and I think this is a great irony of South Carolina's history, many of those settlers were actually enslaved Africans. So there were enslaved Africans in South Carolina well over a century before the first English settlement was even here. Now, the thing about San Miguel de Guadalupe is that it was a colony that only lasted for a few years. And this colony, this attempt at a foothold in North America, was considered by the Spanish to be a failure because of the fact that the colony itself was destroyed via a slave revolt. The Africans who lived in San Miguel de Guadalupe eventually rose up in rebellion against their Spanish masters, and the colony essentially disappears from Spanish records after the 1530s. So to the earlier question about intermarriage between the Africans and the indigenous peoples, that's probably already happening in the 1520s. Because once that colony is destroyed, we don't really have a concrete answer for what happened to the enslaved Africans who were there. But our best guess is that, quite simply, they fled into the swamps and the forests of South Carolina and intermingled with the indigenous tribes that were already there. But as you can see, South Carolina's history is already tied to African slavery. And for those of you who don't know, the history of African slavery is very much tied to the European exploration of the Americas. Christopher Columbus himself in the 1490s, early 1500s, he goes from simply being an explorer for the Spanish to being a royal governor of the island of Hispaniola. And while royal governor, he enslaves hundreds of thousands of indigenous folks, many of them who die working on these various labor systems throughout the Caribbean. And what happens is that as the indigenous population starts to decline in the New World, really more so in the Caribbean at first and then elsewhere in the New World, the Spanish and the Portuguese alike begin looking to West Africa as a place from which they can draw labor to be used to develop their colonies in the Americas. These earliest colonies include, of course, the Caribbean, and then later on Brazil and South America, and certainly their attempt to create a colony at San Miguel included hundreds of enslaved Africans too. So from the very beginning of the history of South Carolina as a place of European interaction and conquest, you already have enslaved Africans being used there for many different kinds of labor. Any questions before I go on?
Dr. Greene.
Yes.
Is there any record anywhere of possibly where the enslaved people came from in West Africa, the people who ended up in San Miguel de Guadalupe?
That's a good question. We have some scattered records about where they came from. Now, the thing about the slave trade itself is that we do have some detailed records of where a wide number of enslaved Africans came from. Most of them came from present-day West Africa, places like Ghana, places like Angola, further to the south. We think that most of the enslaved here probably came from what was then known as the Gold Coast, which is now present-day Ghana. But actually, to your point about where they came from, this is going to become really important with the Stono Rebellion, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the origins of where enslaved Africans came from becomes important because throughout the Americas, as the Europeans become more firmly entrenched in North America, South America, and the Caribbean, and as they begin figuring out what kinds of cash crops they want to grow in different parts of the Americas, whether it's tobacco in Virginia or cotton in Mississippi or sugarcane in present-day Haiti, they begin looking to get enslaved Africans from parts of Africa who have experience and expertise in growing those particular crops and in doing the kind of work environmentally that's required to harvest those crops too. Now, above all else, before we move on, I do want to make one more point about early enslavement. We refer to enslaved Africans and the labor they do as unskilled labor. That could not be further from the truth. A lot of the labor enslaved Africans are doing in this time period throughout the Americas is labor that takes considerable know-how. It takes a lot of experience. And above all, it takes an understanding of the land that they're being brought to. And so the Europeans are really using and exploiting this labor precisely because the Africans from West Africa are so well equipped to do the kind of essentially environmental engineering needed to create a wide range of crops that'll be shipped from the Americas back to Europe. Any other questions before we move on? All right. Oh, go ahead.
This is kind of backtracking a little bit,
Sure.
but I'm from Florida, and so we go to St. Augustine a lot.
Mhm.
And I don't know if this is whitewashing history or if it's correct, but there's a lot of talk about an effort for the Timucuans to kind of preserve themselves. They made a effort to assimilate and to intermarry with the Spanish. You touched on Ponce de Leon a little bit. And so they talked a lot about assimilation, and you talked a little bit about the different politics of the different tribes. Was there a grand effort for assimilation in some of the tribes here in South Carolina? Was that a political effort that happened at all?
You mean as in assimilation into European society?
European society, yeah.
You know, that's a good question. Here in South Carolina, it wasn't quite the case. And there are a number of factors for that. The biggest one being, as you're going to see, is that the tribes here in South Carolina gradually understand that their position is really as a buffer between the English and the Spanish. And so they have a different kind of politics here in terms of dealing with the English and the Spanish than the tribes do in Florida, for example. Like the tribes in Florida, they really have to only worry about the Spanish, and that's it. But though that comes with a different set of questions, whereas the tribes in the Carolinas, they're having to deal with the English to their north, to their east, and then the Spanish to their south, as you're going to see in the map in just a moment. So the politics here, that's a great question. But the politics throughout the Americas, they really depend on which European power you're dealing with, and then also what those European powers are willing to do. Because again, in South Carolina, for a long time in the colony's history, the actual settlement in South Carolina is actually in a pretty precarious position. So there's less an attempt at assimilation here than there was, say, in Florida or other parts of the Americas too.
I have a question also, please.
Cool, go ahead.
You mentioned that the earliest explorers of North America were the Spanish and the Portuguese, both of which were Catholic nations.
Yes.
And it seems to me that I remember reading somewhere that there was a papal bull that divided up the so-called New World between Spanish and the Portuguese, which is, you know, the Spanish had South America and Brazil, and could you enlarge on that?
Sure. So what you're referring to is what's called the Treaty of Tordesillas, that was signed in 1494, excuse me. And essentially, it was a papal ruling that gave the New World essentially and divided it up between Spain and Portugal. Now, real quick, and again, this is just me trying to get through this as quickly as possible. But one of the reasons that it's really the two Catholic countries that are leading the way in exploration is because Spain and Portugal had already spent decades, not really centuries, especially in Spain's case, fighting against Muslim empires in the Iberian Peninsula. In Spain, it's called the Reconquista, which was a period where various Spanish kingdoms from the 700s until 1492 are actually pursuing a war where they're trying to push Islam out of Spain and Portugal. Now, this conflict, the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula, when it's over, it's going to give Spain and Portugal a leg up on the other European powers, because the Spanish and the Portuguese have been heavily influenced by technology coming out of the Muslim world, by advances in mathematics, navigation coming out of the Muslim world. The fact that Spanish and Portuguese governments had to centralize much faster than France or England did in order to fight the Muslim empires in Spain and Portugal. All these factors are going to leave Spain and Portugal in a much better position in 1492 to begin their exploration of the Americas. And the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 certainly gives them papal authority to do that. Now, here's the thing. As you mentioned, those are two Catholic countries. Nations like France, which in this time period is still a Catholic nation, and England, which will eventually become a Protestant nation, they say, okay, that's all fine and good. We really don't care about that, though. But nonetheless, the Spanish and the Portuguese have a massive head start. That's why when we're talking about the history of Spanish and Portuguese exploration in the Americas, so much of it takes place in the 16th century. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and hurry through the rest of this very quick, because I do want to get the Chief Hatcher pretty soon. Sorry, just for a quick second. Now, the English, when they arrived to Carolina Colony, or to create Carolina Colony in the 17th century, in the 1660s, they are doing so with the explicit purpose of essentially spreading slavery into North America. Now, the map you see here of Carolina Colony includes, of course, both North and South Carolina. But the first settlers to Carolina Colony were actually from the English colony of Barbados, as you see here, Barbados and Bermuda. Now, Barbados and Bermuda both were essentially massive slave plantations in the Atlantic Ocean, being used by the English to create cash crops like sugarcane, etc. But the desire of plantation owners who lived in Barbados and Bermuda to have more space to essentially move onto the continent of North America, and to have more space to not only stretch their legs, but to have more land with which to work and to cultivate through their slaves. This really leads to the founding of Carolina Colony in the 1660s. So South Carolina, from the very beginning, for the Spanish and the English, it's being used for slavery. And of course, in 1663, when the first constitution for Carolina Colony is written, it's written by John Locke, the man who today is best known for his writings on individual freedoms and individual liberties, a prominent theorist in the Western tradition of democracy and human rights. He actually has his start essentially trying to promulgate a charter for Carolina Colony in the 1660s. Now, I mentioned this very briefly because as we move forward in the Modjeska School together this semester, one of the things you're going to understand is how much South Carolina is very much at the center of European American history moving forward. And the history of talking about human rights, talking about civil rights, the rise and fall of slavery, so on and so forth, it starts with the beginning of Carolina Colony itself. And so keep that in mind as we move forward. And as you can see on the screen, this portrays both the enslavement and the slave trade of Africans and also the slave trade of indigenous peoples too. I don't want you to forget about that. We often kind of fast forward through the enslavement of indigenous peoples, but one of the issues that really plagues Carolina Colony early on is that folks from the Yamasee tribe and other tribes are actually enslaved by the English and are being sold to the Caribbean at the same time as Africans are being brought from West and Southwest Africa to work in the Caribbean, to work in Bermuda, Barbados, and later on in Carolina Colony as well. And by the way, back to Julia's question about where enslaved Africans are from, if you look on the right-hand side here, this is an actual advertisement you would have found in a newspaper in North America in the 18th century. And it shows that they're saying these Negroes have arrived from the Windward and Rice Coast. They're telling you where they're from, and the implication is that if they're from the Rice Coast, it'd be perfect for growing rice, which is, of course, one of the major crops in South Carolina. So again, the location of where the Africans are from certainly plays an important role in how these Africans are being used throughout North America. And again, this is a quick painting of rice plantations, which as we move into the 18th century, in the Low Country especially, rice becomes one of the early profitable crops from the Low Country, from Charlestown, later, of course, Charleston. Indigo, another important crop. This was used to dye clothing in Europe to give it a rich, dark blue color. Indigo becomes one of the most important crops out of South Carolina, moving into the 18th century. But this actually goes back to the question Tiffany had raised about assimilation and how different tribes are living with these different European powers. As you can see from this map, right, by the middle of the 18th century, of course, the English are occupying most of the eastern seaboard, but to their south are the Spanish. Now, this competition between England and Spain for control of the East Coast is going to affect the Native Americans and how they deal with the European powers, and it's also going to influence the enslaved Africans too. By the 1730s, the Spanish are beginning to essentially put out feelers amongst enslaved Africans in the Carolinas, saying, if you flee to Florida, if you make it to Spanish-held Florida down here, and you decide to take up arms on behalf of the Spanish government against England, then the Spanish will grant you your freedom. African slaves in the Carolinas begin hearing about this, and so you start to see an uptick in enslaved Africans trying to flee, actually not north as you will with the Underground Railroad in American history, but actually fleeing south to Florida in the 18th century. Now, I'm going to go through these very quickly because I do want to get to Chief Hatcher as soon as possible. But you do have conflicts being fought throughout South Carolina between the British, or English on the one hand, and the indigenous tribes on the other. So you have conflicts like the Yamasee War, where the Yamasee tribe felt, and this again goes back to Tiffany's question, and also Dr. Hale's question, where the Yamasee felt they were being exploited by the English in their trade networks. They were infuriated with Indian or indigenous folks being captured and sold into slavery. And the deer population in the Carolinas is actually declining because the English are killing more and more deer to sell their meat, their furs. All of these things combined to push the Yamasee to go to war with the English in 1715. The thing is that the Yamasee War is a complete disaster for the Yamasee tribe. By the end of it, most of the Yamasee are either killed or have been displaced, either forced to flee further west, or they've been sold into slavery in the Caribbean. And the thing is that the Carolina colony itself is almost destroyed by the war. The Yamasee, the Muskogee, the Cherokee, Catawba, all these tribes joined forces to fight against the English. At one point, Charleston itself is nearly threatened by destruction. The colony loses hundreds of settlers in the process. Per capita, population-wise, the Yamasee War is one of the bloodiest wars in American colonial history. But the English are ultimately able to push the Yamasee and other tribes back, And this really opens up what we call the Midlands and the Upstate to further colonization by the English in the 18th century. And again, this is just a very brief map showing where some of the battles were. As you can see, they're getting very close to Charlestown, to present-day Port Royal, etc. Again, this shows you the brutality of these wars that are taking place in the 17th and 18th centuries, where some of the English colonies are on the verge of defeat and destruction, fighting against the indigenous peoples. Now, this does lead to the creation of Georgia colony in 1732. Georgia is actually created as a colony more so as a buffer between the very profitable South Carolina colony in the north and the Spanish Florida colony in the south. We all think of Georgia as being this place where criminals are sent, members of the penal process in England are being sent for rehabilitation. That's true, but a bigger reason for Georgia's founding is to serve as a buffer zone. And keep in mind that that buffer is also meant as a place where the English can stop Africans from fleeing from South Carolina to Florida, who were trying to flee to freedom. And this leads us to the Stono Rebellion. So after this, I'll turn it over to Chief Hatcher. The Stono Rebellion in 1739 was one of the largest slave revolts in North American history. This comes at a time when there are slave revolts in New York in the 17 teens and 1740s. And this comes at an era when the population of enslaved Africans is growing by leaps and bounds in the colonies of North America, not just in South Carolina, but in all the colonies, right? So Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, all these places, they have enslaved Africans in them who are integral parts of their colonial economies. Now, the Stono Rebellion was sparked by 20 Africans who essentially were trying to make their way southward to Florida. Now, many of these Africans we do know came from what's called the Congo Kingdom in Western Africa, present-day Angola. And many of these enslaved Africans actually had considerable training and experience as soldiers in West Africa. Those were skills that when they were brought to North America, they hadn't forgotten about. They remembered them quite well. But the Stono Rebellion begins in 1739. Along the way, several English settlers are killed, and the rebels actually almost make their way to Florida. However, the Carolina colony's governor is able to muster up a militia that stops the Stono Rebellion. And as a result, dozens of enslaved Africans are killed, both those who were involved in the rebellion and then those who were not involved at all, but they're killed, they're executed as an example to other Africans. And actually this marker I'm showing you right now, this actually details the Stono Rebellion in greater detail. It mentions how as the rebellion grows, September of 1739, they take on more Africans, they kill at least 20 colonists, but the militia destroys most of the rebels. The thing is that what they were trying to do is they were actually trying to reach Spanish Florida. They knew if they reached Spanish Florida, they'd be in the all clear. But these enslaved Africans who lived in South Carolina, they lived in a world where, again, the borders were not concrete. They were not fixed. They were actually quite fluid, where they knew of the Spanish being in Florida, where they knew that the English were fighting these wars of colonial control and empire with England and France. The enslaved Africans in North America knew about that. Okay. All right. So, okay. So the question about the Citadel being founded as a result of the Stono Rebellion. Yeah, that is actually that's partially true. Certainly the Citadel is being created more so as a response to slave rebellions in general, not just Stono Rebellion, but as you're going to see later on in this class, other rebellions that come down the road too. The thing about Dr. Goldman's question about the Citadel and the Stono Rebellion is that South Carolina's history in the 18th and 19th centuries is shaped entirely by the institution of slavery. And as you can see here, one of the first after effects of that rebellion is the state, or rather the colonial legislature, passing the Negro Act of 1740. Now, this is the first act in Carolina's history that prohibits the teaching of enslaved Africans how to read or write. It prohibits enslaved Africans from assembling in groups or to raise food or money on their own. Some enslaved Africans actually had side crops that they developed where they grew crops and sold them in the market. That stops. This Negro Act that is designed to really restrict the movement of Africans, restrict what they can and cannot do, this stays in effect all the way until 1865. And so you're already seeing the contours of how South Carolina deals with race and ethnicity. That's already starting well before there's a United States. It's starting with Stono Rebellion. It's starting with their attempts to create Carolina Colony as a place for slavery and for oppression. Okay, so I have done enough talking, for the moment. Before I turn it over to Chief Hatcher, and Ms. Dawson asked a question about actually they did. The Spanish did usually keep their promises. Again, the idea was that if you were African and you fled to Spanish territory, as long as you took up arms for the Spanish government against the English, you were basically free. In fact, the Spanish even allowed the creation of what was called Fort Mose in Spanish Florida. That was essentially a settlement of free Africans. These were the Africans who fled from Carolina, Georgia, who made it to Spanish Florida. Okay, any other questions?
What was the name of the settlement again, please?
Fort Mose. So that's I'll just put it up in chat really quickly. So that was, or rather to everyone, that's Fort Mose. So again, that was in Spanish Florida. It was really the first settlement of free Africans anywhere in North America. Now this settlement at Fort Mose, by the way, is not gonna go away anytime soon. We'll talk about it again, actually, get to the 19th century. All right, so I do want to go ahead now. I'm going to turn it back over to Brett so we can introduce Chief Hatcher, because while a lot of this history is important in understanding the context of South Carolina's history in the colonial period, it's also really important to understanding the history of Indigenous folks in the here and now, in the 20th and 21st centuries. So I'm going to hit stop share for the moment. And Brett, go ahead, please.
Well, thank you, Robert. I want to bring up that we didn't really get to the Barbadian influence well enough, but we'll come back to that and look at the first. But I do want to give Chief Hatcher time to talk, and do want the people that missed it much earlier. The Chief Hatcher is a year younger than me, which makes him born in 1949, and had the experience of being in Vietnam. He was in the military from the time he was 18 and served 20 years. He was,
Brett, speak up.
I've been talking and been muted. Thank you, Marjorie. I was giving you the background on Chief Hatcher that some of you missed because you came in later. That the chief is the chief, Harold Hatcher, of the Waccamaw people, and it's one of it's 6 or 7, and Chief Hatcher will correct me, of the state recognized tribes, and there's one federally recognized tribe in South Carolina, and those tribes have a South Carolina American Indian. Chief, you're going to have to help me. I told you I couldn't remember the name of the thing. This is a group that we've been working with for 20 years, but with Will Gowan, when he was one of our members, and he led the Edisto people. But Chief Hatcher has been in the military for a long time, a lot of rivers in Vietnam, and he grew up in Conway, South Carolina, and we're going to hear from the chief now. Chief, are you out there? I still hope you're out there. Where'd the chief go? Well, we seem to have lost Chief Hatcher. Robert, why don't you talk about the Barbadian influence, which I think is very significant. We kind of skipped over that while I get the chief on the phone and find out if he lost the feed.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think Chief Hatcher is here. He's just muted. Yeah, if you can go ahead and just mute him if you can.
Well, that's one way to shut me up.
There we go.
Chief Hatcher, I think we can all hear you now.
Well, I'm sorry, but I can't help it. He put the mute button on off or whatever. He was asking me to relate to you folks some of my experiences here in South Carolina. And I'm a bit older than most of you folks, and thank you, Doctor, for the presentation. I grew up in a time when there were white and black schools. Of course, they called them colored in those days. And they were white and black water fountains and white and black bathrooms and all that sort of stuff. I don't think, except for Brett, that there's anybody else out there that ever saw any of that stuff. But Indians were a little bit different than, we weren't white and we weren't black. And people tend to not discriminate on what you've got on your birth certificate or what you got on your ID card. They look at you and they decide whether they're going to like you or not like you. And back in those days, you know, they didn't, South Carolina had no official Indians. But I went to a white school, but we lived in black neighborhoods. And we were kind of misfits in either place. At the school I went to was Myrtle Beach Elementary School on 10th Avenue, Myrtle Beach. It's gone, it's moved now, but they had, because it was a white school, they only had one type of water fountain in it. The blacks went to a black school. But if I went to get a drink of water, there was a fight because they didn't want me drinking out of their water fountain. So generally the Indian kids would go outside and drink out of the garden hose. Of course, I never thought much about that at the time. Looking back, I was only like 7 years old in those days. I was in the high school, as a matter of fact, when the schools became integrated. But my mother was born in 1913. And she died when she was 98. She has got Catawba blood and Waccamaw blood. But she was afraid to admit that she was Indian because in the days when she was a kid, the Indian Citizenship Act happened in 1924. Indians up until that time were not allowed to own property or vote, all that sort of stuff. And she thought that if she became known as an Indian, she'd lose her Social Security and all that sort of stuff. It was not justified, but that's what she believed. So it took her for a long time to admit that she was, or to admit by joining the tribe. She became a Waccamaw, officially became a Waccamaw when she was in her 80s. But, you know, as the doctor had said earlier, when you look around outside, all of the land in this area was occupied by Indians. There were houses out there. There weren't houses out there like you see them today, but they were houses and gardens and where people had raised their family. People were raised and raised their family on the same area. But right after the Revolutionary War, the new state of South Carolina gave land grants out to people. I don't know why they did it, but I assume it was the governor's brother or some senator's brother or whatever. They decided to just give the land away. And there goes my telephone. One of my fans are calling. Sorry about that. It hadn't rang the whole time. At any rate, that'll quit in just a second. when they gave the land grants away, there were people living on them, on the land that they gave away. Oh, for God's sake. I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do about that. But
it's okay, Chief. What year are you talking about when the land grants were starting to be given away?
Right, sometime right after the Revolutionary War. And when they did that, a lot of people were living on the land already. They had their houses there and places where they'd raise their kids and all that sort of stuff. But when somebody came up and said, this land is my land now and you need to move, they didn't understand that. So the land that they had raised their kids on and all that stuff suddenly became somebody else's land. Now, the Indians didn't have titles and deeds because we didn't have even a courthouse or anything to record it in. We never kept any birth certificates or bills of sale or anything for land to a non-Indian or whatever. But whenever they went to take the land, so you're going to build a plantation or something on it, the people didn't want to move. So he would go back to the officials in the state or the government or the county or whatever. And he would say, well, you know, I got this land, but I can't do anything with it because there's people living on it and they won't leave. So they authorized them to use deadly force if necessary to get those people off. Up in the area where the Demery settlement was, if people are not familiar with the Demery settlement, that's where my people were. It's up around the Aner, between Aner and Conway, right off of Highway 501. It's well advertised on the internet if you want to look it up. The Dimery settlement. My great granddaddy, a fellow named John Demery, who wasn't known as John Demery when he was born, because Indians changed their names throughout their life. They were not born with names like Demery or John or whatever, because those are names that most of them, when they left the plantations, as the doctor had said earlier, our people were enslaved too. And just like the black folks, when they left the plantations, they usually left with the name of the owner. And that's how they got the names Smith and Turner and all that. And that's how I got the name Hatcher. But when John Demery, for whatever reason, was moved off of his property, he didn't move away very far. He probably just found an untitled area somewhere close by, and he lived there the way he had lived on the settlement where he had lived before. That was in 1813. He and some other peoples in the area pooled their money together and bought the property that became the Demery settlement. It was 300 and something acres. I don't know how much you paid for it. We got the original, not the original, but we got a copy of the deed where he bought it from a fellow named Josiah Lewis. That was the land he had before, but he had to buy it again to have it again to raise his family. And a lot of that, all that time frame between the time that the Demery settlement formed and the time that they moved them off the properties, people had a lot of bad experiences. They got to where they didn't like white people and they didn't like black people. My daddy hated both. He used called a black man the N-word, and he called white people niggas. And I never knew what that meant, but he hated them both. He said, they're not going to make either one of them out of me. But they learned to take care of themselves. It was the law didn't enforce anything, and they still don't. As a matter of fact, we have a cemetery up in Orangeburg that people just bulldoze, which is a felony in the state, but they will not enforce it. I've written the Attorney General. I've done everything but stand on the governor's desk, and they will not enforce it. I don't know why. But Indian people, and I'm not saying anything I'm saying to complain about it, because I wouldn't change a single day in my life if I went back. I'd live it all again the same way it was. I left school one time going back home. This was on 10th Avenue, Myrtle Beach. There was a place there called Mammy's, or not Mammy's, but Inez's Diner. The building's still there, but it's not a business anymore. It's just an empty building. And I was walking down the road, and these four guys, I guess high school kids or something, drove by. I was probably 7 or 8. And they threw an apple at me and hit me in the forehead, or the side of the head, actually. Well, it scared me, one, because they were four pretty good sized guys, and two, it hurt when the apple hit me. And I ran into Inez's diner, and she was a black lady. And I regret to have to say this, but it is true. I was only 7, and I wish I could go back and change it, but I can't. It's too late. But I want to say this because I think it's important for everybody to know that all the people, when they're young, they take on the attitude and the prejudices and all that of all the people around them. So anyway, I went into Inez's diner crying, and she asked me, she said, "Son, what's wrong?" And I said, "Them people threw that apple at me and hit me in the side of the head and called me a nigger." And she said, "Son," she said, "you can't stop ignorant people from saying ignorant things." Trying to be kind to me, trying to ease whatever pain I was feeling. And the part that I regret to say is that I looked at her and I said, "Miss Inez, it would be okay if I was a nigger, but you're a nigger." And I regret that so badly now. I wish there was any way I could go back and just apologize to her. But people, especially even now, are very, very hate-filled. I wasn't hate-filled. I was just ignorant. But there's a lot of people that are full of hate. And I joined the Army in 1968, and as he said, I retired in 1988. And I bought a business called Diceco Incorporated. And I wanted to register it as a minority-owned company. So I went to the Small Business Administration there in Columbia. And they told me there are no Indians in South Carolina. Well, that was a surprise to me because I had lived there my whole life. My mother had lived there. My father had lived there. We knew who we were. But it became a drive to me to make it dawn in South Carolina there were Indians, and it was okay to be an Indian, because it used to be something that most people didn't want to be. And that brought on the drive for recognition in this state. Not just me, but a lot of people have experienced the same things. And we've come a long way in the state, but we got a long ways to go. And just like the NAACP, and I think the chair lady of the Columbia NAACP is here, we've got to learn, Indian people have to learn how to stand together against issues, because these folks that's in Columbia and these folks that's in Washington, D.C. are not going to do anything for us if we don't start smelling pretty bad, put it that way. We've got to stand on their desk, and we need to unite. The minorities need to unite. And one thing we really have got to learn to do, both blacks, whites, Hispanics, Indians, everybody has got to learn to go to that poll and put these jackasses out that need to be put out. And there's a bunch of them around here that need to go. I don't know precisely what I can say that would make folks understand what it's like to be caught between a rock and a hard spot, so to speak. Indians are working with Indians, and I don't think it's just Indians. I think all the churches and all that have the same thing. It's like herding cats. If you get 5 Indians that you want to get together and go do something, every one of them's got a different angle they want to go. And it's very, very hard to get them together. But the one thing that to me is interesting, and I don't really understand it, is that when you go to a politician, if I go and say one thing and another Indian goes and says something else, y'all need to go get together. They don't tell that to the black people, or at least I don't think they do. They don't tell it to the Hispanic people. But the Indians, they want everybody to be in the same bucket. Now, I think that if we can hook together with the NAACP and the caring and thinking white people, because there's a lot of them that don't think and don't care. And I don't mean any offense by that, but just the way I see it. We vote against ourselves every election. But if we could get everybody together like you're trying to do now, we could swing a pretty good sized hammer in this area. And people would have to start changing some of this mess that they deal with. How long did it take us to get the flag off the Capitol building? To get the banner off the Capitol building?
Too long, Chief.
Absolutely, absolutely. Why I don't get it. American Indian women suffer from abuse, rape, and all that at a rate 10 times higher than the national average. There's something wrong with that. our people earn about 27%. Earn 27% less than white groups, white people with the same education level. Our dropout rate is 5 times as high as the Caucasian dropout rate. And I'm not isolating us from the black population either, because I think they suffer the same thing. And we need guidance in Indian country. Indians are brand new in this state because we didn't have Indians until the Waccamaw people got recognized in 2005 officially. And then it even caused them heartburn because they told us then that you cannot use this recognition as a right to sue for land. So now every individual in this country has a right to sue for land if they think people have taken land away from them. But we're not supposed to because we're not, because our recognition, you have to be recognized to be an Indian now, you know. We're the only people that face that too. And since they said they were going to recognize us only if we promise not to sue for land, we have to give up a civil right to be noted as an American Indian. We've turned invisible. I don't, and tell me when I need to shut up because I will. We turned invisible. Like take, for example, Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark discovered the route to the West, according to the history books. And in the same damn history book, it says they were led, fed, clothed, and protected by Sacagawea and her people. Now, if they walked in Indian trails, how in the hell did they find the route to the West? That's amazing to me how people can accept that. But, and I apologize about my language, but I was in the Army 20 years and I got an excuse. And also,
Chief, one of the reasons we invited you is because you speak truth to power. I've known you for a while, and you've been there for a long time doing what you're doing, and I'm so pleased that we're raising up folks that agree with you, white folks and black folks that understand there's more of us than there are the people that are the problem. And I'm looking forward to working with the Waccamaw people and the other tribes that you're the president of. Chief, tell me that it's called the American
South Carolina Indian Affairs Commission.
The South Carolina Indian Affairs Commission, which sounds like some kind of state agency, has been a member of the Progressive Network for many, many years. Dr. Will Goins, who is one of our original members, passed away a few years ago, and Dr. Goins was called himself a whole long list of things, but they were all derived from Cherokees. And Dr. Goins was had a PhD in anthropology, and he there is a video of Dr. Goins on your Class 1 study guide that you should watch. It's about 25 minutes long. And I'm really looking forward to working with you, Chief, as we put some of the programs that we're doing in place with more people that understand why we're doing it and the strategy behind it. And we'll take some questions now for the Chief. And then we still have to talk about the Constitution that created the United States of America and the state of South Carolina before the evening's over with. And we've got 26 minutes, unless people want to stay longer.
Well, I would like to meet that doctor that did the talking there. I don't remember his name.
He passed. We'll talk about that later, Chief. Now, y'all, if you have questions for the Chief, unmute yourself and ask him.
Yeah, I have a question, and this probably, were you some years ago featured on the For the People show along with other Native American leaders with Listerville Middleton?
Yes.
Oh.
Okay, and were you the person that did the poem?
I don't remember doing a poem,
Okay.
but there's been several documentaries and even one movie that I'm in.
Okay.
But, you know, I don't see how I can put a head like this in too big a space, but maybe it takes a big place to hold it.
I was really impressed with that show. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the comment.
I have a friend who is a Native American activist for disability rights, and I know that there are some specific healthcare concerns that happen with different tribes. Have you noticed that you have any specific healthcare concerns?
Yes.
Could you elaborate?
Indians suffer heavily from diabetes. Flat feet. I'm flat-footed as a duck, and I spent 20 years in the Army and almost 12 years with the 82nd Airborne Division, jumping out of airplanes. Heart or high blood pressure, that's another big thing for us. Almost every Indian, when they get into the middle ages, when they get to their mid-range of life, they tend to have those illnesses. So it's pretty prevalent. And I wanted to say something else. The doctor was talking about, and some lady asked about intermarriage between natives and black people. There was a law that I imagine most of you have heard called the one-drop rule. You ever heard of that? Well, the one-drop rule required that if they saw any indication that a person had any black blood in them, they had to call them a Negro on any official government document. Now, that was all over the Southeast. It might have been all over the country, I don't know. But there was another rule that they had. They could not call an Indian on any document. We called it documentary genocide because they wanted us to disappear in fear that we were going to sue for some land at some point. We still suffer from that, as I mentioned earlier, where these recognition law in the state requires that it actually demands that we don't sue for land to become recognized. But because if you go to the old census reports, they were not allowed to put Indian. And if they had saw any black indication, they would have had to put Negro. And if you had a person that was named as a mulatto, if you ought to go back and look at your genealogy on the census reports, you'll probably find you got some Indian in all of you. So that we all are probably pretty much kin.
More questions of the chief?
Yeah, Chief, one question. I know that, and I've read a little bit of scholarship about this, that there's this discussion about the various ways in which Indian populations have been racialized and oppressed, whether it be very, very limited notion of self-determination or assimilation or outright annihilation. Was there any effort, so you say in South Carolina that in effect there was a lack of recognition, so that was sort of really an effort to disappear the group entirely. Was there any, I know there's this discussion about the history of the Indian schools further west, but there was no such thing as an Indian school here in South Carolina as you understand it from your own experience, correct?
There was a school on the Demery settlement was called they called it the Indian school.
Ah, okay.
It was not the type that the Carlisle schools were.
Carlisle's, right. Uh-huh.
They were some in South Carolina, and I do know one or two people that their mother and father or whatever went to those schools. But the Demery school, which where my grandfather, my father and my aunt and his sisters and brothers went, they outlawed it in 1925 or 26.
Okay.
They didn't outlaw it, but they decided they weren't going to support a black school and an Indian school in the same county. So they decided to put the black and the Indian people in the same school. And I apologize for having to tell you this, but it's the way it is. My grandfather refused to put his kids in the black school.
Understood.
And he ended up suing the county of O'Ree to have a facility built to educate his kids.
Mm-hmm.
And they wouldn't do that either. So they made it so that they would come out and look at each child individually and decide whether they would go to a black school or a white school, depending on the color of their skin and facial features and all that. And I had one uncle that went to the black school while his sister, the same mother and same father, went to the white school. So this state is not well known for its good decisions. And I never. Sometimes I want to move out of the state.
You're being kind. Okay, thank you. That's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Marjorie here. Chief, my father actually grew up on a creek reservation in Winder, Georgia. And so you're right, we're probably kin. But the other thing is that I did, in fact, I'm old enough to have observed, and though never attended segregated schools. But I worked in Virginia back in the 50s, and those schools were still segregated. And so you saw the very different qualities of schools, and that went on greatly.
When were you you saying in Virginia was still segregated?
In the 50s. In the 50s, those schools that, particularly Prince George's County, but also they literally were still segregated, if not legally.
Well, I can't believe you're old enough to remember segregation, because don't look like much over 18.
Bless your heart.
Well, I apologize for the way this country treated you.
Mm.
And if I could go back and change it, I would. But I just like to kick some of them rear ends that cause it.
I agree.
But I love you, kid.
There's some present company too that I would include in that.
Absolutely. And it just amazes me how these people like to be lied to. And I think he unites people under hate. But I ain't supposed to talk about that. I'm a leader of a 501c. So.
Okay.
Well, if there's anything I can do for you, let me know.
Likewise. Thank you.
Hi, Chief. This is Felicia Robinson.
Hey, Miss Robbins.
Hey, and I wanted to tell you, when you spoke and you talked about the one drop rule, I actually quite often heard that. And my grandfather was actually Cherokee. And I'm almost 50. And I think what I've experienced so much in my life, and I went to school right at the point when things were segregated in the 70s. I was born in the 70s. Was that they didn't talk too much about anything with us or what components we had. They just didn't talk a lot about my Indian heritage. So a lot of what you talked about, I heard about it, but it wasn't exactly explained to me. So I fell under that notion of there wasn't a lot taught to us or much conversation about it, almost as if we were just kind of thrust into it and we lived it and what we were taught. So a lot of what you've mentioned, I've heard that as I grew up, and it was never really explained as much. But that rule of notion, and I think in some of the reading that I did preparing for the class, they talked about, and maybe the professor will attest to this as well, that you always follow the mother's lineage. And in the respect of my grandmother, she was Black and my grandfather was Cherokee. So was that the assumption that they follow that one drop rule, and that they followed the mother's lineage versus talking about what the male lineage was?
Well, you know, you're correct in your theory there. We did follow the maternal lines.
Okay.
And it actually makes sense because you always know who the mother is.
Right.
But, I don't know if my answer is the actual question. My answer is to the question you're actually asking. But if the people come out with a census and they looked at your grandmother, was it?
Yes.
If they saw any sign that she had Negro blood, they would call her a Negro. If they saw any sign that he had Negro blood, they would call him a Negro. But if they didn't see that sign, they would call him a free person of color, mulatto, something of that nature. But that's on the official government documents. He would call himself whatever he felt like he was. Now, he may decide that he's going to follow his mother's, you know, he would follow his mother's line, and he would probably still be Cherokee. But as far as the government was concerned, they would write him down on the census, probably a free person of color.
Well, Chief, go ahead, Bernie.
Okay, just three very quick points to follow up on what Marjorie said. My grandmother actually was Tuscarora from North Carolina. Second point is that South Carolina schools really were segregated until the 1960s. I taught during the year 1970-71, which was the first year that they actually integrated the schools. And what's interesting is that the one-drop rule was practiced differently by Spanish and Portuguese people than it was by the English and French, because the Spanish and Portuguese, if you had one drop of white blood, you were white.
Okay.
And so that's why in Argentina now you can find people who look like me and they're considered white because they have one drop of white blood. And there are hardly any black folk in Argentina on paper.
Really? Well, you know, it's, to me, it's just amazing that how this, because that's what it is hatred. It's a way to let everybody know. It's like the Jews when they were in World War II had to wear the big J on their collar. It's to let everybody know who you are so they can discriminate and be mean to you legally. This country has no real heroes, if you know what I mean. I mean, they have some now, but you look at Andrew Jackson's picture on the $20 bill, and he was the biggest jackass there ever was. Somebody should have shot him. Look at Columbus Day. We got a Columbus Day, and this man will let his men take the breasts off young women to make damn tobacco pipe. And you get off the subway there in D.C., and here's Columbus with his arms opened up like he's welcoming you to D.C. It just irritates me. But you can't get these politicians to care because I've written all of them I can think of and said, you know, well, call it America's Day or something. We need to get rid of Columbus Day, and we need to get Andrew Jackson off of $20 bill. That don't mean I'm gonna throw all my $20 bills away, but
agree.
Say again.
I just said I agree.
Chief, I'm going to put a pin in that and ask you to stay with us for a while. There may be more questions, and we can go on beyond 8:30, but it's 8:18 now, and we still got 2 constitutions to wrap up today before we come back next Monday to talk about the Civil War and Reconstruction, which is another long conversation. And so, Robert, we want to move on to the Constitution, the state Constitution, and the federal Constitution.
Let me say first that I can't stay. I've got to.
You can't stay. No,
but if you would give everybody my email address, I would appreciate that. And I'll put them to work. I'll ask them to write letters and stuff. If we get everybody holding hands here, we'll make some difference in this state.
Well, Chief, I know we can do that. That's why we're having this meeting. But if there's anybody that's got something they got to say to the Chief, do it now if he's got to leave.
All I said was thank you very much, Chief.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you. And
thank you so much.
My email address. If you want to contact me, by all means, we'll carry on our conversations on email.
Well, with the Chief's permission, I'll send everybody his contact information.
Okay. Thank you, Chief. We appreciated you on the call tonight.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
You too.
Take care, Buster.
Thank you, man.
So the only other thing I have to add to what we're talking about with the Chief's experiences in our lifetimes was that in 1968, when I was a student at the University of South Carolina, we found out that the Native people in Ridgeville, South Carolina, were not included in the integration of the schools down there. And there was a little school in Ridgeville that had 3 teachers. Only one of them had a high school degree even. And that the Native people, grades 1 through 8, went there. And then they would transfer to the high school in St. George. When they went to the high school in St. George, they didn't know doodly, and they all failed out. And so at that point in 1968, there'd never been a Native that had graduated from high school. And as a project of AWARE, which was the group we were running at the University of South Carolina then with the Southern Student Organizing Committee, we started a freedom school and got a house donated and had teachers that literally came from Harvard and the opportunity to run a school for a year engendered a boycott of the Indian school, and the state highway patrol would visit the Indian parents, threatening them not to boycott the school. And that went on for a year, and there was a lot of stress and strain and gunfire. And at the end of the year, they integrated the St. George School for the Native people. And so that relationship that we have is, what, 50 years old now? And that Andy Spells, the chief of the tribe that has now taken an organizing position, they have their own tribal center in Ridgeville, South Carolina, was our guest speaker last year. And so, Robert, I'll turn it back over to you to pick up, and you've got like 9 minutes to wrap up the constitutions of the United States of America. And there may be some point in continuing beyond 8:30 and people drop off, and we'll keep you posted. Take it, Robert.
All right, so I'll do my best to wrap up by 8:30 because I know we all have things to do as well, albeit at home or via social distancing. But one of the things that I do want to kind of point out right now is as we begin talking about the Constitution and we talk about the early Republic era, I do want to point out one very important thing before we get to that. When I covered the American Revolution, and we're going to really fast forward through that, but the one thing I do want to mention is what's called Lord Dunmore's Proclamation, which was basically a proclamation sent out by Lord Dunmore, who was the royal governor of Virginia in 1775, when the Revolutionary War begins. And his proclamation essentially said, if you are an enslaved African and you belong to a patriot who was a slave owner, then if you flee to British lines, then you can help the British not only win the Revolutionary War, but in the process, you'll receive your freedom. I only mention this in relation to South Carolina history because the Revolutionary War is the largest moment of upheaval for slavery in American history until the American Civil War. As an example of this, in South Carolina by itself, over 25,000 slaves flee from the Patriot lines to British lines in South Carolina during the war. 25,000. All right. I mention this because this is going to play an important role in how South Carolina's planter elite class thinks about the national constitution and the state constitution in the 1770s and the 1780s. When you're talking about what Americans are doing to create a new nation in the 1770s and 80s, and in particular, how you think about how folks in South Carolina, the ruling class, the planter elite here, are trying to create a new state and national government. A lot of what they're trying to do is focused on making a government that can, above all else, keep slaves in line. Because they remembered what happened the last time central authority fell apart during the Revolutionary War. All right, so when we get, and by the way, a lot of this, again, if you want more details, shoot me an email afterwards, or you can see it on our website as well. But I do want to very quickly talk about how, again, the state is this place where so many of the arguments about freedom, about central government, et cetera, they're playing out on the state level as well. Now, in South Carolina history, the big dividing line has been for most of the state's history between really the low country and the upstate. Between, in this time period in the 18th century, between the planter elite based around Charleston and the independent farmers who were living in the Midlands and the upstate. And this is actually why, for example, the state capital is Columbia and not Charleston, right? Charleston in the 1780s was not only the largest city in South Carolina, it was one of the largest cities in North America. But most of the folks living in the upstate felt there was too much power invested in Charleston, and so a compromise was reached where Columbia, a new city, was founded in the 1780s to serve essentially as the state capital. Despite all of that, many of the state government offices had offices in Charleston and Columbia. Suffice to say that rivalry between the low country and the rest of the state would not easily go away. Now, nationally, after the Revolutionary War, you have this break between what are called federalists, people who believe in a strong central government, and anti-federalists, people who were fearful of a new constitution that will create a strong central government. And certainly in South Carolina, you have federalists and anti-federalists who are on opposite sides of these debates. And the picture you see here is of Indigenous Burke, who was an anti-federalist in South Carolina. They kind of see the Constitution as a threat to what they fought for during the Revolutionary War, which in their eyes was pushing against an oppressive central government in Great Britain, creating a freer form of government at home, with the caveat, of course, that that freedom would help them actually keep slaves in line, right? So the anti-federalists, they are certainly really focused on making sure that the federal government is not too strong. This is the big debate in the 1780s. But what I want you guys to understand is that that debate is wrapped up intensely with the debate over slavery as well. At the same time, you have folks like Rawlins Lowndes, who is a leader in South Carolina, who wants to make sure that the backcountry is not left out, that the upstate is not left out of these debates over where the state and federal governments are going in the 1780s.
Robert,
again,
do you intend to project the slides?
Are they not projecting now?
No. I don't think so. Just wanted to alert you to that. I know you got to go quickly. There they are.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, my apologies about that. But actually, that reminds me. So this is actually kind of a map of laying out what the state looks like in terms of regions, but also looks like politically. Again, in the 1780s, a lot of the state's power is wrapped up in the Low Country, in and around Charleston. But you're starting to see in the Midlands and the upstate especially, more and more independent farmers who want to weaken the control of the state government by plantation owners. Now, this is actually the count for the ratification of the National Constitution in South Carolina. As you can see, the Low Country is largely in favor of it. Charleston, Georgetown, and Beaufort vote 99-1, whereas the backcountry is largely opposed to it. Again, this divide over ratification is because the Low Country sees an advantage in having a powerful central government. Not just because of economic reasons, because they're thinking a strong government will keep the national economy going and make it competitive on the international stage. But they're also saying a strong central government can pay dividends in terms of keeping slaves in line. Again, they're wanting to make sure the federal government has rights and authorities to, for example, capture fugitive slaves and bring them back to their slave owners wherever they are captured. And again, this Low Country elite that we're talking about, like Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, John Rutledge, essentially any street in Columbia is named after these people. The Low Country elite, they become really strongly tied to the Federalist Party, which is the pro-Constitution party in the 1780s and 90s. Again, they support a strong central government because, unlike, say, folks like John C. Calhoun later on, or other state leaders from South Carolina and the South, they are saying, actually, a strong central government is good for keeping the institution of slavery going, as long as they don't get any bright ideas about emancipation. But if they can have tools to capture fugitive slaves, if they can have tools to regulate the slave trade coming in and out of Charleston, that's fine with us. It'll give us more tools to keep enslaved Africans in line. And again, the other party at the time, Democratic Republicans, they're mostly from the backcountry. They're like guys like Pierce Butler and Charles Pinckney. They are opposed to this centralized government. They don't want friendly relations with Great Britain. But again, what I want you guys to understand is that this political break over the Constitution in South Carolina is very much linked to the Low Country versus upstate debate. The Low Country, again, is very much in favor of a strong constitution. The backcountry sees a strong constitution as a threat to their rights as independent farmers. Independent farmers who, some of whom harbor aspirations of buying and selling slaves, but for the most part see themselves as being better than the low country because, at least in this time period, they are not so dependent on slavery as their counterparts are in the low country. Now, as this national constitution debate is wrapping up, in South Carolina, there's also the ratification of a state constitution in 1790. And essentially, that constitution is written to kind of fit in the national constitution. But as you can see from the screen, I have some of the key parts of that constitution. Essentially, they shrink the state house, and at the same time, they increase the property qualifications to hold office. What they're trying to do is they're trying to enshrine that a certain white male elite controls the state. So you have to have a certain number of acres of land, own a certain number of slaves, or at least $11,000 worth of real estate in $1790. As you can see, they also have 2 state treasuries, 2 state offices in Columbia and Charleston. The state itself is still very much caught up in this argument and this debate between the low country and the upstate. And so this first constitution of 1790 is really meant to try to increase the power of the planetary elite as much as it can. And this will reverberate throughout the state's history, even really up to today, if you really think about it. And again, you have folks in the backcountry who are arguing that the state legislature in 1790 does not reflect the population distribution. Most of the folks in the state legislature, this new constitution, are from the upstate. And yet, most of the state's population actually lives in the backcountry. Fortunately, today, we don't have any issues nationally or regionally about representation in the government versus population. That's certainly an 18th century problem, right? But certainly at this time, the Constitution of South Carolina is being written to weaken the power of the majority of the population. And by the way, it's worth noting that when we mean population living in the backcountry, this is of voters. The majority of people living in South Carolina are actually Black. They're actually African slaves. So let's not forget that either. All of this is being done with the context of South Carolina being a majority African part of North America. Now you do see some attempts, and I'm almost done. I know we're just over 8:30, but I'm almost done with this part of the lecture. You do see that in the Low Country, there is the rise of anti-slavery sentiment. This began during the Revolutionary War. Some white Americans began to take seriously this idea that if we're fighting for freedom and individual liberties, then perhaps we should extend those liberties to people of African descent. Not everyone agrees to that, but certainly some folks in the Low Country are fearful that their counterparts in the backcountry who are not as dependent on slaves may begin to take on this anti-slavery sentiment in the backcountry. However, every person in the legislature from the backcountry is a slave owner. So even anti-slavery sentiment in the state is not represented in the state legislature in the 1790s. It's nowhere to be found there. It exists in the backcountry, but it's not actually in the state government. Okay. And again, part of this anti-slavery rhetoric and sentiment, it comes from some of the religious denominations in South Carolina. You have Methodists, Presbyterians, and Baptist churches in the backcountry that, unlike their counterparts in the Low Country, they're actually pushing some anti-slavery ideas amongst their white parishioners. You also have the presence of a small but vocal group of Quakers who live in the backcountry and the Midlands in South Carolina as well. Not very many of them, but there are enough of them to agitate somewhat against slavery in South Carolina. But this is where I want to wrap up tonight, because as I said earlier on this evening, South Carolina and what happens here does not exist just in a vacuum in this state. It'll have reverberations throughout the United States and throughout the world. And the rebellion in Saint-Domingue, the Haitian Revolution of 1790s, is actually going to reverberate here in South Carolina as well. When the Haitian Revolution begins in 1791, the slave owners in Haiti make appeals to South Carolina directly, not to the US federal government, but to the state government in South Carolina, requesting arms, ammunition, and a detachment of South Carolina militia to be sent to Haiti to put down this slave revolt. Now, South Carolina does agree to send ammunition, to send arms and materiel to help put down this rebellion, but they do not, wisely, send any militia to fight in Saint-Domingue. Nonetheless, this full-scale slave revolt in Haiti becomes the main political debate in South Carolina in the 1790s. If you're a slave owner in South Carolina, you are not simply thinking of yourself as a South Carolinian or as an American. Above all, you are a slave owner. And if you notice a slave revolt taking place somewhere else in the Western Hemisphere, in Haiti, then as a slave owner, you know that kind of revolt could also happen in South Carolina. And so there are attempts in South Carolina to send money to Haiti, to send arms to Haiti. At the same time, slave owners who are fleeing from Haiti, they flee to, among other places, to Charleston. And so if you read Charleston newspapers in the 1790s, you will often see stories about plantation owners from Haiti who are bringing their slaves with them. And the big fear in Charleston is that the enslaved Africans brought with their masters from Haiti to South Carolina are going to bring with them the contagion of rebellion to South Carolina as well. And so for the planters in South Carolina, the slave owners in South Carolina, they don't see the Haitian Revolution as some faraway thing. They see the Haitian Revolution as essentially the first stage towards a potential slave revolt in South Carolina. That constant fear of slave revolt is going to drive South Carolina's government throughout the 19th century. It really starts with the Revolutionary War in America and then proceeds with the Haitian Revolution in the 1790s as well. So I think that's where I want to stop. That brings us up to 1800. Any questions?
Robert, I want to make a couple points before we take questions. And we're willing to, I'm willing to stay, and Robert probably is too. Robert said you had to leave, but we can carry the discussion on, but I want to make a couple points on things that I think that we skipped over that I think are critical. And it's the Barbadian influence. And that too few people know that South Carolina was the only one of the 13 colonies that wasn't started from the mother country. Started from second and third generation Barbadian plantation owners who had a reputation for being the most brutal slave owners in the hemisphere. And it was because the Lord proprietors that were running South Carolina couldn't get it together. So they jobbed it out, and South Carolina became the only one of the 13 colonies with a slave economy. And so that kind of like set the tone for what we then had the representatives from South Carolina at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia were all slave owners, and the United States Constitution would have banned slavery, I believe, if it had not been for the delegation from South Carolina. So Robert, you have anything to add to that real quickly, because we want to open it up for questions, and the people that need to leave can leave, but we can carry this on.
Mm-hmm. No, that's certainly correct. And, you know, I do want to point out that the state delegation to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, their main role, their main job is to essentially keep the institution of slavery going. They definitely want to make sure that the new national constitution does not infringe on slavery, doesn't infringe even on the slave trade. Now, at the Constitutional Convention, a deal is reached between Northern and Southern delegates to table the idea of ending the international slave trade to the US for 20 years. And so between 1787 and 1808, South Carolina in particular is going to invest a lot of money into importing as many enslaved Africans as they can, because they assume, rightly, that in 1808, Congress is going to go ahead and ban international slave trade. But again, what South Carolina's planter class and the government elite want to do is to really keep slavery going as much as they can. Because as Brett pointed out, slavery is the whole reason for the South Carolina colony. And by the late 18th century, the planter class acknowledges this and wants to keep slavery going. This is why, by the way, South Carolina is such an important leader in promoting ideas of how to keep slavery going deep into the 19th century, with folks like, of course, our good friend John C. Calhoun, among others. Okay, so I see Bernie has a question about, will you discuss the relationship with the Haitian Revolution and Louisiana Purchase? I can knock that out really quickly. So by the time the Haitian Revolution reaches its full fruition in the early 19th century, by 1803, 1804, the French still have ownership of what's called Louisiana Territory. You know, the large part of the Midwestern United States today that includes everything from Louisiana in the South all the way to the border with Canada, including a large part of the Midwest and the West. Now, the thing about Louisiana Territory was that the French always assumed that they would have a permanent presence in North America. By 1803-04, however, Napoleon, who was, of course, at this point Emperor of France, he realized that the war in Haiti is not going well, that France is going to likely lose Haiti, and so he decides that Louisiana Territory is just not worth holding on. The thing is that Louisiana Territory the French held was actually meant to be the breadbasket for Haiti. Haiti itself, Saint-Domingue, was basically a large island-wide plantation. It could not be self-sufficient in terms of foodstuffs and supplies. And so the idea for decades before this, for centuries before this, was that Louisiana Territory was France's breadbasket to ship food and other needed supplies to Saint-Domingue. And then Saint-Domingue could focus exclusively on the sugar production and sugar plantations. However, once the Haitian Revolution is beginning to turn against France and it becomes quite clear France is going to lose control of Saint-Domingue, Napoleon decides to go ahead and sell Louisiana to Thomas Jefferson in 1804. And so that really explains that relationship between the Haitian Revolution and Louisiana Purchase. In essence, if you don't have a Haitian Revolution, then the history of the United States looks incredibly different from the get-go.
When you said that they asked South Carolina to send the militia and the militia decided not to go, what influenced that decision? Because if it was so important for the slave owners to not have that influence and people were rushing over here, it would seem counterintuitive.
Well, not exactly, because you got to keep in mind that's a great question, by the way, that if you're in South Carolina, your greater concern is keeping the militia here to prevent a slave revolt here. And so their big fear is if we send the militia to go fight in Saint-Domingue, then the forces we would use to put down a slave revolt in South Carolina are gone. And so their hope is if we can give the folks in Saint-Domingue materiel, supplies, weapons, money, we can keep the rebellion there and basically make sure it's suppressed. And by the way, the folks in South Carolina are also assuming, well, the French army can truly put down this revolt. They don't really need our help to do this. And then they quickly realize, oh, the Haitian rebels are beating the French, they're beating the Spanish, they're beating the British. They really don't want the state militia to go down there and plunge and get slaughtered. They're basically saying, we've got to hold our militia here in case, again, there's a rebellion that breaks out in South Carolina.
And that point was?
And part of that reason was because the vast majority of the people in South Carolina were enslaved.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't send your few cops off to take care of a problem somewhere else. So are there any other questions for Dr. Greene or observations about how we can improve this process? I really do appreciate everyone sticking with us. We still have 21 people. They're dropping off now, though. Well, hearing no comments, I do want to direct everyone's attention to the fact that the Class 2 reading is online at the Modjeska School site, and we're going to be picking up post-Constitution of the state of South Carolina, looking at the lead up to the nullification period in South Carolina, leading up to the Civil War and leading up to Reconstruction, which is a huge piece of history that's very important. So Dr. Greene, you have some words if no one has any questions.
Well,
I just make sure that you take some time to do the readings this week. And again, I'm looking forward to talking to everyone again. This is a process, a teaching style that we're all kind of working through together. But I think this week's class, next week's class is going to really help us to understand how South Carolina becomes both a bastion of slavery and oppression, and then during Reconstruction becomes for a brief moment the closest thing it'll ever be to actually being a true democracy.
I endorsed the comment from one of the members of the class that said, I learned more in this 2.5 hours with Dr. Greene than I learned in all of my high school.
I really appreciate that.
I would like to think that's a compliment on Robert, but it may be a criticism of South Carolina's minimally educated.
Both propositions could be true, Brett.
I would agree.
Dr. Greene, there is a question I have, but if I may bring it up the next class period, and then I don't want to take it here. I don't want to say
Oh, sure. Sure.
You don't have to answer it in full tonight, but if there are resources you could point me to, that would be helpful. Knowing that Charleston was settled by these English Barbadians, and having an interest in genealogy and family history research, is there some resource that would tell us family names of those Barbadians that may still exist in South Carolina today, and whether those folks are still benefiting from the privilege of having been founders of Charleston and slave owners?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think your best bet would be to actually go through Richland Library, which actually has some great genealogical resources. And I'm sure they include some information on folks from the Low Country, as well as, of course, in the Midlands too. Richland Library has some great genealogical resources, many of which are actually accessible online right now. So that might be your best bet to actually look into this. And of course, the libraries out of Charleston, including College of Charleston's website, their library website has some good information too. So I will look at those places, Richland Library, and then College of Charleston as well.
Thank you.
I have another suggestion for the future. Just take a trip to Barbados and spend some time there and see all of the names of the streets and the houses and the people that make you think you're right here still in South Carolina. They're almost identical.
Field trip.
Field trip.
Field trip. Well, one of the things that I know is that most of the people that Cecil's looking for, I know people with those names that are people of color that belong to the people that Cecil's looking for. The Pinckneys and probably the Preludes. So are there more questions out there in video land? Well, hearing none, I want to thank the remaining 19 participants for their stamina and staying with us, and hope that you feel that this is a worthwhile endeavor, and we'll do it again. Is the next class next Monday, isn't it, Robert?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Next Monday.
And so because of the circumstances that we're all facing here with the pandemic, we have started late and have had to squish up some classes. So we'll not be skipping every Monday, but the class schedule is online at the Modjeska School. And I wanted to mention to the remaining people here, I should have mentioned it earlier, that we lost one of our members a few days ago to the coronavirus. Someone that's been with us for 15 years, Tim Modjeska, who was our coordinator when we had the grant to help people get into the Affordable Care Act in 2013, 14. And Tim was working for the Indivisible organization nationally and went to a national meeting a couple of weeks ago. Got home and they sent out an email saying somebody was positive, y'all need to quarantine. And Tim and his partner, Maris Burton, quarantined themselves, and Tim died within 10 days. Tim was a very healthy young lad of not in his early 50s. And so what this is it's a very serious warning for those of us to pay attention to what we need to do to not get sick. And so I'm gonna leave you with that. And Dr. Greene, thank you so much, and Todd Shaw, and if John, I think John had to leave to take care of kids, but we've got some terrific professionals. I'm an amateur historian. I'm a professional agitator, so that's what I bring to the table. But we want y'all to stay with us, because this is what you're learning now is the tools that you're going to be able to use to be a more effective citizen real shortly, because we need to be. This is a time of great danger, but the other side of that coin is a great opportunity. And so thank you all for coming, and I'm going to say bid adieu and close the meeting. Thank you so much.